The first sound before sunrise was not a rooster. It was cedar splitting. Sadie Mae Harrow stood in the doorway of the ranch house with one hand on the frame and watched a hired man drag the last post from the little fence around her mother's grave. The post scraped across the yard, leaving a raw line in the dust. Behind him, two more men loaded rails into a wagon marked with the neat black letters of Red Bluff Savings and Loan. They worked fast. Not cruel in any dramatic way. Just steady. That made it worse. They handled Ruth Harrow's grave fence like scrap lumber. "Stop," Sadie said. Her voice did not carry far. The tallest man near the wagon turned. Horace Bellwether wore a dark town coat too fine for ranch dust and gloves too clean for morning work. He took off his hat as if courtesy could cover what his men were doing. "Miss Harrow," he said, "I told your father this boundary marker could no longer stand on property under pending foreclosure. That is not a boundary marker." Her fingers tightened on the doorframe. "That is my mother's grave." Bellwether looked past her toward the small rise where Ruth Harrow lay beneath a wooden cross. The dirt kept swept even through drought. The little bell tied to the crossbeam still as stone. "I understand the sentiment," he said. Sadie stepped off the porch. "No. You understand numbers." One of the hired men looked away. Bellwether's face tightened. But he did not raise his voice. "Your father owes $3,417. The final extension ends Friday. If payment is not made, Harrow Ranch becomes bank property. House, barn, grazing land. Well, and all improvements upon it." "Improvements," Sadie repeated. The word tasted like ash. A cough tore through the thin walls behind her. Deep, wet, and familiar. Ephraim Harrow was awake. Bellwether heard it too. For 1 second, something almost human crossed his face. Then he folded it away. "I am not without sympathy," he said. "But Red Bluff is full of failing ranches. If the bank makes one exception, every man with a sad story will ask for another. My mother is not a sad story." "No," Bellwether said quietly. "But the debt is still due." He signaled the men. The wagon rolled out with the grave fence stacked in back. Sadie stood in the dust until the sound faded. Only then did she go inside. Her father sat on the edge of his bed, bent forward. One trembling hand pressed against his ribs. Once, Ephraim Harrow had filled doorways. Now his shirt hung from him like it belonged to a stronger man. "They took it?" he asked. Sadie did not answer at first. His eyes dropped. "I need to tell you something." Her stomach tightened before he said another word. "The cattle money," he whispered. "The 200 from last month." Sadie went still. "No. I thought if I could win enough, I could pay Bellwether something. Buy time. Maybe get medicine too." "You gambled it." His shame was worse than a denial. "I was ahead for a while." Sadie turned toward the window. Outside, the empty space around Ruth's grave looked wider than the whole Texas plain. "That was our last money." "I know. That was winter flour. Salt. Medicine." "I know." She faced him then. And the anger came up clean and sharp. "No. Puh. You do not know. Because if you knew, you would not have put my mother's grave on a card table." Ephraim flinched like she had struck him. "There may be one way left," he said. Sadie did not like the sound of that. "Cole Vance came yesterday." The name changed the air in the room. Everyone in Red Bluff Crossing knew Cole Vance. A man with a scarred face. A quiet spread up at Coyote Ridge. And a past people lowered their voices to discuss. "What did he want?" Sadie asked. Ephraim looked at his shaking hands. "He will pay the debt." All of it. Buy the ranch clear. Leave me here till my time is done. Sadie waited. Her father finally looked up. He wants you to marry him. For a moment. Even the house seemed to stop breathing. Then Sadie laughed once. Without humor. So this is your last gamble. Sadie. No. This time, you are not betting cattle. You are betting me. She walked out before he could answer. In the barn. She saddled Copper with hands that did not shake. She tucked her mother's silver comb into her pocket. Mounted. And turned north toward Coyote Ridge. If Cole Vance wanted a wife, he would have to answer to her first. Coyote Ridge Place sat under a line of red rock hills, half hidden by scrub oak and dry grass. It was not the outlaw den Sadie had imagined. No broken bottles in the yard. No men sleeping under wagons. No stolen horses tied in the shade. Just a low cabin. A small barn. 3 good horses. And a water barrel covered against dust. That bothered her more than disorder would have. A monster's house should have looked like a warning. Sadie tied Copper to the porch rail and stepped back before the door opened. Cole Vance stood in the frame. He was taller than she expected. Lean from work instead of comfort. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. A pale scar cut from his left brow down toward his cheek, pulling one side of his face into a permanent look of hard patience. But his eyes were not wild. They were tired. Miss Harrow, he said. You made my father an offer. I did. Then you can explain it to me. Cole looked past her toward the empty trail, as if checking whether she had come alone. When he saw no one, his jaw tightened. Your father should not have let you ride here by yourself. My father has lost the right to decide where I ride. Cole accepted that with a slow nod and stepped aside. Come in. Then, the cabin was plain, but clean. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner. Shelves of books lined the far wall, and beside them hung maps marked with pencil. Sadie noticed everything because fear made details sharp. You read, she said before she could stop herself. Some men do worse things in private. She did not smile. Cole poured coffee for himself, then pushed an empty cup toward her without filling it. You said no before. I remember. I did not come for coffee. No, he said. You came to see if the devil has decent floors. Sadie held his gaze. Does he? Sometimes. The honesty landed strangely. She sat, but kept her back straight. Why me? Cole did not answer at once. Outside, a horse stamped in the corral. The little sound filled the room. Because a man alone with my past has no standing in Red Bluff. He said, I can buy land, pay taxes, keep quiet. It will not matter. They still look at me and see what I used to be. And a wife fixes that. No. But it makes them hesitate before they call me a threat. So I become your respectability. His face hardened. Not with anger, but with shame. You become my lawful wife. In return, I pay the debt. Clear, Harrow Ranch. Leave your father in that house. And give you money in your own name. Not your father's. Not mine. Yours. Sadie stared at him. That was not how men usually spoke about money. The stories, she said. Are they true? Some. Were you Cole Vance then? No. The room seemed to narrow. What name? Levi Bannon. She had never heard it. But the way he said it told her the name had weight. I rode with Rafe Calder. Cole said. I did wrong. I will not dress that up. Later, I gave testimony against him and the men who followed him. That bought me a new name. Not a clean soul. Sadie's fingers tightened around her mother's silver comb inside her pocket. Why tell me? Because if you marry me, you should know which ghost will be sitting at the table. For the first time since dawn, Sadie felt the edge of her anger shift into something colder and more useful. Then here are my terms, she said. Cole sat still. My father stays on Harrow Ranch until he dies. My mother's grave is fenced again before winter. Half of what remains after the dead is mine. In writing, you do not touch me unless I choose it. You do not decide where I go. And if Red Bluff asks whether I was forced, I will tell them the truth. What truth? That I had no good choices. Sadie said, but this one is mine. Cole looked at her for a long breath. Then he stood, opened a drawer, and took out paper. By noon the next day, Red Bluff Crossing knew. By 1. Half the town stood outside the church. Sadie walked in wearing Ruth Harrow's yellowed wedding dress and her mother's silver comb. Cole waited near the altar in a dark coat that did nothing to soften his scar. Sheriff Amos Keene watched from the back pew. Reverend Pike's voice trembled through the vows. When he asked if Sadie took Cole Vance as her husband, the whole church seemed to lean forward. Sadie looked at Cole. Not safe. Not gentle. But honest enough to put the danger on the table. I do, she said. No one clapped. When the papers were signed, Sadie took the bank receipt first. Only then did she let Cole lead her out into the white Texas sun. Past every staring face in Red Bluff Crossing. Coyote Ridge felt different after the wedding. The cabin was the same. The same porch boards. The same scrub oak. The same red hills holding the last light of evening. But Sadie crossed the threshold as Mrs. Vance now. And the name sat on her shoulders like a coat cut for someone else. Cole carried her trunk inside and set it beside the bed. You take this, he said. Sadie looked at the narrow mattress. Then at him. And you? Floor by the stove. You do not have to perform decency for me. His eyes lifted. I am not performing. The answer was quiet enough to unsettle her more than charm would have. He pulled a folded blanket from a chest, laid it near the door, and placed his boots beside it with careful order. Respect was in the bargain, he said. I intend to keep at least that much clean. Sadie did not know what to do with a man who spoke of respect like a debt he meant to pay on time. So she unpacked 3 dresses, 1 sewing box, Ruth Harrow's silver comb, 2 books, a small cloth pouch with the money Cole had placed in her name that afternoon, witnessed by the bank clerk and Sheriff Keene. Her own money. That fact frightened her almost as much as the marriage. Night came slow. They ate beans and cornbread at opposite sides of the table. Cole did not ask her to talk. Sadie did not offer. Outside, the horses shifted in the corral, and the wind dragged dry grass against the cabin wall. When he lay down by the door, Sadie stayed sitting with one hand on the sewing box. You sleep like that every night? She asked. Near the door. Yes. Old habit. From Levi Bannon. The name changed him. Not much. Only his hand paused over the blanket. Only his jaw went still. Yes, he said. Sadie waited for more. None came. The next morning, Cole was gone before sunrise. Not far. She saw him in the yard splitting wood. His movements steady and economical. No wasted strength. No show. The cabin felt larger without him inside. Sadie cleaned because standing still made her thoughts too loud. She wiped shelves, checked flour, opened cupboards, and finally came to the books. 1 volume sat behind the others, shoved too far back to be accident. The cover was worn soft. When she opened it, A name had been written on the first page in neat black ink. Levi Bannon. Below it, in smaller writing, a man can cross a state line and still carry himself with him. Sadie was still holding the book when Cole stepped in. His eyes went first to her face, then to the open page. "You went looking," he said. "I went cleaning." That book was not dirty. It was hidden. The silence between them tightened. Sadie set the book on the table. "You told me the name. You did not tell me the man." Cole removed his hat slowly. Levi Bannon was useful to bad men, he said. He could plan routes, read people, remember doors, windows, habits. He told himself that made him clever instead of guilty. And Cole Vance. Cole Vance is what was left after Levi got tired of helping wolves count sheep. It was not enough. Sadie's voice hardened. "Do not give me pretty language. I married you with my eyes open as far as you allowed. If more trouble is tied to that name, I need to know before it reaches this door." Cole looked toward the door as if the trouble might already be standing outside. Before he could answer, wolfbeats rose from the trail. Sadie's hand moved without thought toward the rifle over the mantel. Cole noticed. So did the rider outside. "Easy in there." Sheriff Amos Keene called. "It is me." Cole opened the door but did not step aside. Sheriff Keene sat his horse in the yard, dust on his coat and worry under his hat. "3 men came through Red Bluff yesterday," he said. "Asked after a scarred man living north of town. Asked if he went by Cole Vance." Sadie felt the room tilt slightly. Cole's face did not change. "Did they give names?" "No." Keene looked at Sadie, then back at Cole. "But one of them wore a silver spur with a broken rowel." For the first time, Sadie saw true fear pass through her husband's eyes. Not fear for himself. Fear because she was standing beside him. "Rafe Calder," Cole said. The name was soft. The danger inside it was not. Rafe Calder came at dusk. Not with shouting. Not with a dozen men thundering over the ridge. He came with 2 riders behind him and a smile that made the whole yard feel colder. Sadie saw him first from the kitchen window. A tall man on a dark horse. Hat low. Shoulders loose. As if every inch of land he crossed already belonged to him. One of his spurs caught the last light and flashed silver. Broken rowel. Cole stepped beside her. For one breath. He did not move. Then he said, "Stay inside." Sadie looked at his face. "No. Sadie." The way he said her name was not command. It was fear trying to sound like reason. Outside, Rafe stopped his horse in the middle of the yard. "Well now?" he called. "That house really did make you smaller." "Levi." Cole opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "My name is Cole Vance." Rafe laughed softly. "That what the preacher called you when he handed you a wife?" Sadie stood just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. She could feel the old wood beneath her palm. Solid and rough. This was not Harrow Ranch. Not yet home. But it was not a place she would be ordered out of either. Rafe's eyes found her. "There she is," he said. "The respectable Mrs. Vance. I wondered what kind of woman would marry a man like him." Cole's voice dropped. "Leave her out of this. That is the trouble with rings. Levi. They show a man where to cut." Sadie felt the words land. But she refused to step back. Rafe dismounted slowly. His men stayed mounted, watching the house, the barn, the hill road. "You cost me years," Rafe said. "Names. Men. Money. A life that was mine. You built that life on other people's fear." Cole answered, And you enjoyed it until you found a conscience. Cole did not answer. That silence told Sadie more than denial would have. Rafe took a step closer. I did not ride all this way to hear you preach. I came to see whether the old Levi Bannon is still under that clean shirt. Cole's hands stayed open at his sides. Sadie saw how hard that was for him. Then another voice cut across the yard. That is close enough. Calder. Sheriff Amos Keene rode in from the North Trail with 2 deputies behind him. His face was calm. But his posture was not. He had expected this. Or feared it. Rafe turned. Still smiling. Sheriff. You make a habit of riding onto a man's private quarrel. I make a habit of stopping trouble before it gets comfortable. Keene looked at the 2 riders. Hands where I can see them. No one moved for a long second. Then Rafe gave a small, lazy shrug. For today. Then, Keene's deputies took him and his men without a fight. Though every movement felt like dry grass near flame. As they led Rafe past the porch. He looked at Cole. You can hide behind badges. Behind marriage papers. Behind that pretty wife. But you and I know what you are. Cole said nothing. Rafe smiled wider. I will be back when there is no sheriff between us. After they were gone. The yard seemed too quiet. Sadie stepped onto the porch. Cole turned on her at once. You should have stayed inside. And let him decide I was something you kept behind a door. He looked at you like a target. I noticed. Then you know why you need to go to town until this is finished. Sadie's anger rose fast. No. Sadie. This is not pride. This is sense. No. Cole. Sense is knowing when someone is trying to take your choice away and calling it protection. He went still. She pulled Ruth's silver comb from her pocket and held it tight in her fist. I married you to save my mother's grave and my father's land. That was the first choice. Maybe not a fair one. But mine. Staying or leaving now will be mine too. Cole's face shifted. Pain and worry crossing it together. If you were Sadie. She said softly. Almost to herself. Would you run to town where it was safer? Or stay beside the man everyone still calls dangerous? The wind moved through the yard. The little bell she had tied that morning to the barn beam gave one faint note. Sadie looked toward it. Then back at Cole. I choose to stay. She said. Not because I am fearless. Because I am done being moved. Rafe Calder came back before the moon cleared the ridge. This time, he did not come smiling. Sadie heard the horses first. Not many. Enough. Cole was already awake. Standing by the window with his coat half buttoned and his face carved into stillness. Go to the back room. He said. Sadie took Ruth's silver comb from the table and slid it into her pocket. No. He turned. We do not have time for this. Then stop asking me to disappear. Outside. Rafe's voice cut through the yard. Levi Bannon. Come out before I start taking apart this pretty little life board by board. Cole closed his eyes once. When he opened them, the fear was still there. But it had moved behind something stronger. Sadie touched his sleeve. Do not let him choose who you are. Cole looked at her hand. Then at her face. He wants the old name. Then answer with the new one. Cole stepped onto the porch with both hands visible. My name is Cole Vance. Rafe stood near the yard gate with 2 men behind him. Their horses shifted nervously. Sensing what men pretended not to feel. Names are cheap. Rafe said. I knew you when you were honest about what you were. No. Cole answered. You knew me when I was useful to you. That struck something. Rafe moved closer. You handed men over to the law and called it conscience. I handed guilty men over because I was tired of watching innocent people pay for our choices. Our choices. Rafe laughed. You always did dress betrayal in clean words. Sadie stayed just inside the doorway. From there, she could see the barn beam, where she had tied the little bell from Ruth's grave fence. A thin cord ran from the bell to the back of the house, hidden low along the wall. Her hand found it. Cole kept Rafe talking. You want me angry, he said. You want me careless. I want you true. You want me to prove you right. Rafe's face tightened. Sadie pulled the cord. Outside, the little bell rang once. Not loud, but clear. A sound small enough to miss unless a man knew to listen for it. Rafe heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the barn. What was that? The sound of someone being expected. Cole said. Woof beats rose from the north trail. Sheriff Amos Keene appeared first. Then 2 deputies. Then a broad-shouldered older man in a dust-gray coat. Marshal Gideon Pike. Rafe's men shifted. But Keene's voice stopped them. Do not make this worse. For a moment, everything balanced on a blade's edge. Rafe looked at Cole. You still need other men to stand between us. Cole stepped down from the porch. Sadie's breath caught. But he did not reach for a weapon. He stopped a few feet from Rafe. No, Cole said. I need witnesses. Marshal Pike dismounted slowly. Rafe Calder. You are coming with me. Rafe's eyes never left Cole. You could end this yourself. I could. Then do it. Cole's jaw worked once. Sadie saw the old shadow pass across his face. Not hunger. Memory. Then Cole stepped back. No. The word changed the yard. Rafe stared at him. Cole spoke again. Quieter. I will not give you the man you rode here looking for. Keene moved in. Pike gave the order. Rafe was taken without the victory he wanted. By morning, Sadie sat on the church office bench while Marshal Pike wrote in a small black notebook. Mrs. Vance, he said. Were you forced into this marriage? Sadie looked at Cole. Then at Sheriff Keene. Then at the window, where Red Bluff waited outside, pretending not to listen. I was forced by debt, she said. By drought. By my father's sickness. By a bank that took the fence from my mother's grave. Pike's pen paused. But not by Cole Vance. Sadie continued. And after the wedding, I chose to stay. Cole lowered his eyes. When Pike asked for his statement, Cole signed carefully. Levi Bannon, Cole Vance. 2 names. 1 hand. That afternoon, Horace Bellwether came to Coyote Ridge with his wife, Evelyn, and a folded offer. A generous price. Bellwether said. Enough for both of you to start elsewhere. Sadie read the number. It could have bought distance. It could have bought silence. She handed it back. No. Bellwether frowned. Think carefully. Mrs. Vance. I am. Cole stood beside her. Quiet. Sadie looked toward the ridge. Then toward the road to Harrow Ranch. This land is no longer something desperate people sell because powerful men are uncomfortable. Evelyn Bellwether's smile faded. Cole took Sadie's hand where everyone could see. And for once, neither of them stepped back. Ephraim Harrow did not want to leave the ranch. Sadie tried twice. The first time, she brought a wagon, a quilt, and enough stubbornness to move a sick man if love had allowed such things. It did not. Her father sat in Ruth's old chair by the window, thin hands folded over his knees, eyes fixed on the rise where her grave waited beyond the yard. No, he said. You cannot stay here alone. I am not alone. Sadie looked around the quiet room. Dust lay on the shelves. A cup of medicine sat untouched beside him. Rain had stained the ceiling above the stove. Ephraim nodded toward the window. Your mother is out there. Sadie's throat tightened. She would want you cared for. She would want you living. He said. Not spending your days watching an old fool pay for what he broke. Cole stood in the doorway. Silent. Giving them space without leaving her unsupported. Ephraim looked at him. You treat her like she has a say. Cole answered at once. Yes. Sir. Even when she scares you. Especially then. For the first time in weeks. Ephraim almost smiled. After that. Sadie came every other day. She brought soup. Clean sheets. Medicina. And news from Coyote Ridge. Sometimes her father knew the day. Sometimes he asked for Ruth as if she had only stepped outside to bring in laundry. He passed in early winter. Seated by the window. Facing the land. No grand speech. No final lesson. Just a tired man laying down a weight he had carried too long. On the table beside him was a folded paper. His will. The handwriting shook. But the meaning did not. Harrow Ranch goes to my daughter. Sadie Harrow Vance. In her own name. No husband. Banker. Or creditor may speak over her claim. Sadie read the line 3 times before the tears came. They buried Ephraim beside Ruth. More people came than Sadie expected. Sheriff Amos Keene stood near the back. Reverend Pike read the words. Horace Bellwether came too. Hat in hand. With 2 bank men behind him. When the service ended, Bellwether did not offer comfort. He offered paper. The bank removed the fence. He said. Eyes lowered. The bank will pay to replace it. Cedar rails. Lavor. And a permanent grave boundary recorded outside any future claim. Sadie stared at him. That does not undo it. No. Bellwether said. But it records who was wrong. He signed the paper in front of Sheriff Keene. Sadie folded it once. That is the first honest thing your bank has done for my family. Bellwether took the words without defending himself. That mattered. Spring came with rain. Not enough to make the land easy, but enough to soften it. Grass returned in cautious green. The creek moved again. Fence posts went into the earth without fighting every inch. One afternoon, Wesley Creed rode out from the Red Bluff Cattlemen's Association with 5 ranchers behind him. We are asking Cole Vance to join. Creed said. Sadie stood beside Cole. Hands rough from work. Skirt hem muddy. Cole did not take the paper. My wife's name goes on it too. Creed blinked. Cole's voice stayed even. Sadie Harrow Vance owns land in her own right. She keeps books. She works cattle. She makes decisions. She votes. Or, I do not sign. The men shifted. Then Creed handed the paper to Sadie first. She signed slowly. Not because of debt. Not because of fear. Not because someone needed saving. Because the land was hers too. Cole signed beneath her name. Then he paused. Every man there saw it. He dipped the pen again and wrote the second name. Levi Bannon, Cole Vance. The porch went quiet. Sheriff Keene, who had ridden out as witness, gave one small nod. No one clapped. No one needed to. That evening, Sadie and Cole rebuilt the fence around Ruth and Ephraim's graves. They used new cedar rails. Straight and strong. Paid for by the bank that had once dragged the old fence away. But Sadie kept one scarred post from the original pile. The one marked by dust and rope. Cole set it beside the gate. Are you sure? He asked. Yes. She touched the rough wood. I do not want to forget where this started. The little bell from Ruth's cross hung above the gate again. When the wind moved, it gave one clear note. Sadie looked at the two graves. Then at the man beside her. You still think names are cheap? Cole looked down at his hands. Then toward the house where the signed association paper lay on the table. No, he said. Not when you stop hiding from them. They walked back as dusk settled over Red Bluff country. Nothing was fixed perfectly. The roof still needed work. Grief still came without warning. Cole still woke some nights with the past in his eyes. Sadie still missed the people she had lost. But the fence stood. The deed held. Her name was on the land. His true name was no longer buried. At the porch, Cole reached for her hand. Then stopped before touching. The way he always had when the choice mattered. Sadie took his hand herself. Not because a bank had cornered her. Not because her father had failed. Not because Cole had bought her safety. Because after everything, she still chose to stand there. And this time, no one else had signed for her. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.